InkBreaking.com. Lesson 1. Introducing yourself. Present tense. Questions and answers. Jane is a Yank. Is Jane British or American?
Jane is an American.
American. Jane is a Yank. She's an American. Is she an Australian?
No, she isn't. She is an American.
No, she isn't an Australian. Jane is a Yank. She is an American. Who is a Yank?
Jane. Jane is Yank. She is an American.
Jane. Jane is a Yank. She is an American. Jane is sitting in the restaurant alone. Is Jane sitting with a friend?
No, she isn't sitting with
No,
her friends.
she isn't. Jane is
She is
sitting in a restaurant alone.
Sitting in the restaurant alone.
Who is Jane sitting with?
No one.
She's sitting with no one. Jane is sitting in the restaurant alone.
She is sitting in the restaurant alone.
Is Jane sitting in a hotel?
No, she isn't sitting in the hotel. She
No,
is sitting
Jane
in
is sitting in the
a
restaurant. Jane has just arrived in Vietnam. Has Jane lived in Vietnam for 6 months?
No, she hasn't.
No, Jane hasn't lived in Vietnam for 6 months.
6 months.
She has just arrived in Vietnam. Where has she just arrived?
Vietnam. She has just arrived in Vietnam.
Vietnam. She has just arrived in Vietnam. Has she just left Vietnam?
She hasn't just left Vietnam.
No, she hasn't left Vietnam. She has just arrived in Vietnam. She walks to a restaurant. Who walks to a restaurant?
Jane walks to the restaurant.
Jane. Jane walks to a restaurant. Where does she walk to?
A restaurant. She walked to a restaurant.
A restaurant. Jane walks to a restaurant. Does she walk to a cinema?
She doesn't walk to the cinema. She walks to the restaurant.
No, she doesn't walk to a cinema. Jane walks to a restaurant. Does Jane walk to a restaurant?
Yes, she does.
Yes,
walks
Jane walks to a restaurant. She walks to a restaurant. Does Jane take a taxi to a museum?
No, she doesn't take a taxi to a museum.
No, Jane doesn't take a taxi to a museum. She walks to a restaurant. She knows no one in Vietnam and is sitting by herself. Does Jane have many friends in Vietnam?
No, she hasn't any
Jane
friends
doesn't have many
in
friends in Vietnam. She knows no one in Vietnam. How many people does Jane know in Vietnam?
None. She knows no one in Vietnam.
None. She knows no one in Vietnam. Why is Jane sitting alone?
She is sitting alone because she knows no one in
Vietnam. Jane is sitting alone because she knows no one in Vietnam. Jane is feeling a little lonely because she knows no one and has no friends in Vietnam. Why is Jane feeling lonely?
Jane is feeling lonely because she knows no one.
Jane is feeling lonely because she knows no one and has no friends in Vietnam. Is Jane feeling lonely because she has no job?
No, she isn't feeling lonely because she has no job.
Jane isn't feeling lonely because she has no job. Jane is feeling lonely because she knows no one and has no friends in Vietnam. Does Jane have any friends in Vietnam?
None. She hasn't any friends in Vietnam.
No, she doesn't have any friends in Vietnam. She knows no one and has no friends in Vietnam.
She doesn't have any friends in Vietnam.
Quan walks in, orders his food, and sits at the table next to Jane's. Does Quan sit outside the restaurant at a table?
No. Quan walks in.
No, he sits at the table next to Jane's.
He sits at the table next to Jane.
Does Quan walk out of the restaurant?
No. He walks in.
No, he doesn't walk out of the restaurant. He walks in, orders his food, and sits at the table next to Jane's. Where does Quan sit in the restaurant?
At the table next to Jane.
At the table next to Jane. He sits at the table next to Jane's and begins a conversation with Jane. He begins a conversation with Jane. Who begins a conversation with Jane?
Quan begins a conversation with Jane.
Quan starts a conversation with Jane. Quan begins to talk to her.
A conversation with Jane. Quan
Does he finish a conversation with Jane?
Yes.
No, Quan doesn't finish his conversation with Jane.
No,
he begins to talk to Jane.
A conversation with Jane.
What does Quan begin with Jane?
He begins a conversation with Jane.
Quan starts talking to Jane. He starts a conversation with her. Quan asks Jane questions to get to know her better. Does Quan ask Jane questions to hire her for a job?
No, he doesn't.
No, Quan doesn't ask Jane questions to hire her for a job. Quan asks Jane questions to get to know her better. Does Quan tell Jane a story to amuse Jane?
No, he doesn't tell Jane.
No, Quan doesn't tell Jane a story to amuse Jane. Quan asks Jane questions to get to know her better. Jane tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam. Does Jane refuse to talk to Quan?
He doesn't refuse to talk to Quan.
No, Jane doesn't refuse to talk to Quan. Jane tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam. What does Jane tell Quan?
She tells Quan her story and why she's in Vietnam.
Her story and why she is in Vietnam. Jane tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam. Does Jane sing songs to Quan?
No. She doesn't sing any song to
Jane
Quan.
Doesn't sing songs to Quan. Jane tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam. She tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam.